It's our solemn constitutional duty to conduct a fair and honest impeachment trial of the charges against former President Trump, the gravest charges ever brought against a president of the United States in American history. This resolution provides for a fair trial, and I urge the Senate to adopt it. Mr. President, I send a resolution to the desk on my behalf and that of the Republican leader for the organizing of the next phases of this trial.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 47 to provide for related procedures concerning the article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
The question occurs on the adoption of the resolution.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla? Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Romney?